Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 56th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, the first day of hurricane season, we talk about cascading disasters with Aaron Clark Ginsberg from RAND and Miriam Belglidia of Imagine Waterworks. You can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube Live. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear the COVID Calls recorded as podcasts on podbean.com or anywhere that you hear podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help me spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics. Tomorrow, we'll start the first of 5 sessions that I'm doing in tandem with the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I'm really excited to start these. We're going to have these once a week throughout June, and for the first of these, tomorrow we're going to talk about biodiversity and the pandemic with Mary Angeles Arce, Jason Weckstein, and Richard McCourt of the Academy of Natural Sciences. So please do join me for those. And I'd like to remind folks that on Friday, I had a really in-depth and, to me, really eye-opening discussion about COVID-19 in the context of the violence in Minneapolis and the violence around the United States. And I talked with Rashawn Ray and Gonzalo Bacigalupe. So if you missed that discussion on Friday, I would encourage you to go back and check that out. As of today, June 1st, 2020, there are 6,229,408 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 5,871,347 cases reported Friday. 1,799,747 of those are in the United States, up from 1,731,035 on Friday. There are now a total of 104,702 deaths reported in the United States, up from 102,323 deaths reported on Friday. As a way to bring humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story every day, and I'd like to continue that now. Theodore Gaffney, who photographed the Freedom Riders as they protested segregation, dies of COVID-19 complications. This was written by Harmeet Kaur and published on CNN.com April 21st, 2020. In his 92 years, Theodore Gaffney witnessed some of the most consequential moments in history. He served in the United States Army during World War II. One of the first Black photographers in the White House, he took photos of US Presidents Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, as well as Queen Elizabeth II. But he was perhaps best known for an assignment he undertook for Jet magazine in 1961, documenting the Freedom Riders as they journeyed to the Deep South to challenge racial segregation. On Easter Sunday, the legendary photographer died of complications from COVID-19. We kept saying that he survived World War II, survived the struggle of civil rights, he survived a heart attack, his wife Maria Santos Gaffney said. We were praying that he would survive this too, but his body could not handle the severity of the virus infection. In the spring of 1961, then 33-year-old Gaffney was tasked with accompanying journalist Simeon Booker on the first Freedom Rides, in which Black and white cities in the Deep South, in which they went to Black and white cities in the Deep South to protest segregated buses and stations. My job on the Freedom Ride was to document what happened when Blacks and whites sit together on the bus in the front, go to the counters in the bus terminals, drink out of the black or white fountain, go to the colored restrooms and water fountains, and see what happened when they used those facilities, Gaffney said in an interview for the Freedom Riders interview collection, footage of which was used in the PBS documentary Freedom Riders. On May the 4th, 1961, a group of activists, along with Booker and Gaffney, boarded a Greyhound bus from Washington, D.C., with the goal of reaching New Orleans. Gaffney told PBS interviewer Stanley Nelson that he kept his distance from the Freedom Riders during the trip, wary of the risks that came with carrying a camera. I didn't want anybody to know I was a photographer either, Gaffney said in the interview. That was more dangerous than being a writer, because they don't want documentation of things that happened, whether you're a black or a white photographer. He was afraid that the further south he traveled, he said, if people found out he had a camera, he might not come back, and his fears were nearly realized. From Atlanta, the riders split off into two groups as they boarded buses for Anniston, Alabama. Some riders got on a Greyhound, while the others, Gaffney among them, hopped on a Trailways bus that left an hour later. White protesters surrounded the first bus as it arrived in Anniston, attacking the windows and tires and eventually set it on fire. The Freedom Riders were forced to flee into the mob. Meanwhile, as the bus Gaffney was on departed from Atlanta, a group of white men who had boarded began beating the Freedom Riders, Gaffney said in his interview for the Freedom Riders interview collection. As that bus reached the terminal in Birmingham, Alabama, the violence continued. When the bus pulled up, there was a mob. Looked like 1,000 people. They had iron pipes, Gaffney said in the PBS documentary. The mob began beating the Freedom Riders, Gaffney said in interview footage. Police would not arrive until 10 minutes later. With his camera under his coat, Gaffney exited the bus and took refuge in a waiting area in the bus station. Ultimately, he walked away unharmed. The violence in Anniston and Birmingham made headlines. The Freedom Riders tried to continue their journey the next day, but found that no bus driver would agree to transport them. Eventually, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy arranged for the group to fly from Birmingham to New Orleans, which came as a relief for Gaffney. I'd never flown before, but it felt good when that plane got off the runway, he said in the documentary. I'd rather take a chance on getting killed in a plane crash than to get beat to death by hoodlums with iron pipes. Though Gaffney said in the PBS interview that he didn't consider himself to be an activist, his cousin Patricia Johnson said his career was largely informed by his family history. His great-grandparents had been enslaved on a plantation in South Carolina, and his grandparents were sharecroppers in the town of Gaffney, Johnson told CNN. In the 1920s, Gaffney's parents migrated from South Carolina to Washington, D.C. for better opportunities. Gaffney was born in 1927. In 1945, Gaffney enlisted in the Army. Johnson said he would tell his cousins stories about the segregation he experienced during his service. He was also close to his uncle, Johnson's father, who she said had once faced a lynch mob in Montgomery, Alabama. Those experiences were part of why he felt compelled to document the civil rights struggle of the 1960s, according to Johnson. Gaffney was a legendary figure in the family, Johnson said. Despite his achievements, though, his family members said he was always learning and encouraging others to do the same. Okay, I'd like to turn to our discussion for today, and let me introduce our guests. My first guest is Miriam Belglidia. She has over 10 years of experience in resilience planning, hazard mitigation, floodplain management, and disaster recovery. In 2012, she co-founded Waterworks, a grassroots group focused on equitable disaster management. In 2019, she served as a co-founder in shifting Waterworks to Imagine Waterworks, recognizing the importance of creativity and local leadership in addressing climate justice. She currently works for Arcadis on urban and coastal resilience projects nationwide and volunteers her time in support of Imagine Waterworks. Miriam serves as an administrator for the 2,400-person New Orleans Mutual Aid Response Network, which was started during the COVID-19 pandemic and is currently transitioning to address the 2020 hurricane season. My second guest is Aaron Clark Ginsberg. Aaron is a social scientist at the RAND Corporation, focused on improving the lives and resilience of communities. His published research is about hazard management, especially where it can affect humans and their communities. Clark Ginsberg's continuing research focuses on community resilience and disaster risk reduction, critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, risk governance, and disasters in cities. Before joining RAND, Aaron worked as Disaster Risk Reduction Officer for the international NGO Concern Worldwide, where he went to 10 countries to document and synthesize Concern's community-based disaster risk reduction work. I'd like to welcome you both, Aaron and Miriam, to COVID Calls. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks so much for having us.
So let me start the way I usually do, which is to just find out where people are calling in from and how you're doing. So Miriam, can I start with you? Where are you and what's the situation like there?
Sure. So yeah, thank you so much for having us. I am based in New Orleans, Louisiana. So right now we are transitioning into hurricane season, which brings its own sort of level of stress and preparation. And we're obviously doing that in not only the ongoing pandemic, but also against the backdrop of the police brutality and the protests that we're seeing nationwide. So there's a lot going on, but overall doing pretty well, and just trying to stay focused on the work that we have ahead of us.
Are you working from home still?
I am. Yeah, we have been working from home, I guess, for the last 2.5 months, and we'll be doing so for the foreseeable future.
Okay. And Aaron, what about you? Where are you calling from, and what's it looking like there?
Well, I'm calling from Portland, Oregon. There's no hurricanes here, which is, I mean, I guess that's a plus. There has been, police tear gassing protesters, beating protesters. Coronavirus. Yeah, it feels like it's a whole lot to kind of take in. I mean, fortunately, we just moved from DC, and we're close to my family, and we've got a nice place to stay in, and we're healthy, and we're both working remote, and I mean, everything is fine, I guess personally, but yeah, I mean, it really feels like the past few days have been something else.
Yeah, I hear you. Miriam, are you in New Orleans there? Is there a curfew or some sort of police enforcement going on right now in terms of where people can be and when?
There is not. So there were protests over the weekend, and there's a lot of actions that are continuing throughout the week. At the protests, at least that I was a part of on Saturday, things were relatively peaceful. The police did not engage with protests and did not escalate things. So I think, unlike what we're seeing in other cities around the country, it has been relatively quiet. Yeah, but that said, we're obviously seeing how quickly things can change and can escalate. So yeah, for now it is quiet, but we'll see how things go.
Philadelphia is on curfew again tonight. Mm-hmm. We've been getting emails from security and even from the president of the university. I teach at Drexel University, just keeping everybody updated. But, the concept of a curfew was strange enough a few months ago. And now to see a curfew from, protests and violence related to the murder, combined with this, it's just, as you said, Aaron, it's just a lot to take in all at once. And I'm at home.
Yeah.
Are you on a curfew there, Aaron?
Yeah, we've got an 8 p.m. There have been protests, every day and every night, and I skipped out on the curfew. I was 2 minutes late coming home last night because I thought there were protests coming down the street. And yeah, I mean, we had like 10,000 people out breaking curfew and, standing in front of the Justice Center, reacting to the police violence of the past few days, basically. I mean, this was the biggest night was yesterday, because of the stuff that had happened over the past few days. So yeah, we've got another 8 o'clock.
So when we first started talking about doing this session, we were, and what we will talk about today, the conjunction of disasters, the pandemic, and the planning for hurricane season. And now but it's impossible to disentangle those from this situation that we find ourselves in now with the violence. So that will be part of our conversation today, certainly. But I'm going to start, Miriam, with you. If you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little of your own sort of professional background and pathway, and tell us what Imagine Waterworks does.
Sure. So I, as I mentioned, I'm based in New Orleans and I've been here for the last decade, or over a decade now. I currently work for Arcadis, which is an international engineering and design firm, but I volunteer my time with Imagine Waterworks, which I co-founded in 2012. And we're really focused on trying to reimagine the future and looking at things through these intersections of art, science, and connection. So while our focus areas are mainly on water management, climate justice, and disaster readiness, we see things really through an intersectional lens. And so that means prioritizing the most vulnerable in both natural and man-made disasters. And most of our work sort of falls under three broad strategies. We provide direct resources for folks. So things like a hurricane guide and different sort of resources related to water management. We provide space for folks to connect with each other. And I'll talk a little bit more about our mutual aid group. And then lastly, we provide space for folks to explore and sort of imagine what a different future could look like. So, in the same way that right now, the systems of government, the sort of systems that we all have become accustomed to were sort of the imaginings of thinkers, 300-400 years ago. We want to think about what it means to reimagine systems that really work for all people in the future, and what does it look like to give space for that kind of future thinking, and what does it mean to give a platform to folks so that it's not just the current systems that we've inherited that clearly are one could say are functioning as designed to, but are clearly not working for the majority of folks in America. So that's sort of the work that we are focused on doing. Now, my sort of professional background and education background, I have a master's in public administration. I used to work for the city of New Orleans, post-Katrina, doing hazard mitigation work. I received a Fulbright fellowship to do some research on water management in the Netherlands. And so that really combined with the education that I've gotten just living in New Orleans and knowing New Orleanians has really informed my approach to disaster management. And
you said that your organization made a real transition last year, and you changed the name even. And so can you tell us a little bit about what inspired this transition in the organization and how the work is actually different?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that we founded Waterworks, as it was known, in 2012. And at that point in time was really sort of focused on looking at the intersections of water management, flood mitigation, as well as more environmental concerns. So bringing in environmental justice and flooding, which have been kind of historically handled by different agencies, different people. We were kind of looking at what happens when you try to take a more holistic approach to water management. And we were also founded more as a consultancy. And so we were doing sort of, more traditional planning projects, as well as a lot of community-based work, including sort of grassroots workshops and providing resources, a lot of which have to deal with like green infrastructure and things like that. And I think that part of what has inspired the change is that in the last 8 years, we've seen a lot of change on the ground in New Orleans in a positive direction, right? There's been movement in terms of the ways that the city is managing water and looking at disasters. There's been more groups getting involved in water management, disaster management locally. But I think that sort of personally, what was interesting to me was, I'd spent a lot of time looking at sort of water management and disasters in a larger sense, but I started to feel like if we were only looking at things like green infrastructure, then and we weren't focusing on, the climate crisis, we were really quite literally having, drops in the bucket compared to the scope of the issue. And so that prompted us to sort of rethink our approach to the work and what we were going to be focused on, and moving more into the space of focusing on climate justice work. The second part of sort of what brought forth the change last year is really sort of thinking about what it means for people with privilege to step aside and let others lead. So I am a transplant to New Orleans. I moved to the city in 2008, 2009. And, I'm an Arab American woman, but I have a lot of privilege that comes with being white passing. And what we really thought about doing our work is that if you're going to do it well, it's really critical that the folks that are most impacted have a seat at the table and have positions of leadership. And so that also meant restructuring our leadership. And so in stepping aside and making room for others to join our team and to bring on other co-founders, we changed not only the representation within our organization, but then also that brings a whole wealth of experience and expertise. So we have 4 co-founders. We have two women of color. Our director is a trans person who is a native New Orleanian. And they bring, different lenses to this work that certainly broadens my understanding of the impacts of disaster and how we need to be thinking about these issues moving forward. So that was sort of also part of the decision-making for how we transitioned.
Thank you for really walking us through that, because it's amazing to me to think that there was a time in which you could do floodplain management or city planning more generally. And these issues you've been talking about already around climate justice or around social justice, community planning, there might have been some discussion of them, around the time of Katrina, but they were always treated as sort of add-ons or extras, and they've moved to the core, I think. And I want to get to that. And we're going to talk about the implications of that for emergency management too here in just a second. Erin, I want to come to you. You're characteristically prolific, but you've been very prolific lately. And I want to actually just read a little bit from this great Vox piece that you published back in May. You had a whole group of co-authors there. Let me just read. You said in this piece, think about how when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, around 20,000 people took refuge in the Superdome Stadium. By their very nature, hurricanes force people to gather close together in shelters, at treatment locations, and during evacuations at much higher numbers and densities than the CDC recommends for countering a COVID-19 outbreak. The Atlantic hurricane season, you remind us, starts on June 1st, and every state and territory on the Atlantic coast is vulnerable. You co-authored this with the former FEMA administrator, Craig Fugate. So, thank you for terrifying me with that piece and drawing that indelible image back to all of our minds about the Superdome. So, what kind of things should we be thinking about here? What kind of things have planners got in mind when they imagined the worst pandemic to hit America since the 1960s, combined with what is already, I think, predicted to be at least an average, if not above average, hurricane season?
Yeah, it's kind of like imagining the unimaginable, right? You have, what could be some pretty terrible natural hazards coupled with this strong pandemic, and so I've been working on, I guess, a series on sort of, the concurrent disaster of coronavirus meets natural hazard. So I have that piece in Vox on hurricanes, another piece on coronavirus and wildfires, and that was written with a former CAL FIRE chief, actually, David Hsu, who, he knows everything about fires, and he's a great co-author. And then I'm working on another piece with PJM, which is an RTO. They're in the utility space, and looking at how utilities are preparing for a coronavirus and hurricane situation. So I guess, kind of, I've been thinking about what are these sort of common threads, and how do you, what sort of draws them all together. And I think the way that I've started to think about it is, you have, the system, and then you have the people. And, the system, the response system, the sort of resilient system, these official structures, to varying degrees are moving into action and, adapting to try and figure things out. I mean, I think the utility space is, and the wildfire space, they're both particularly strong in figuring this stuff out. They have sort of, it's their job. It's cultures of reliability, strong sort of emphasis on, let's not kill people in the wildfire space. Let's keep our staff safe and put out wildfires effectively. And then in the utility space, it's, we need to keep the lights on. So in the utility space, you are seeing, and you've seen these utilities kind of spring to action, leveraging the networks that they already kind of work with and are connected with, and have engaged with for years, when it comes to establishing sort of reliability principles. Coming together and starting to think through, what are these implications? Let's start coming up with plans. So PJM, this RTO, which is responsible for kind of transmission within, a large region. It coordinates transmission entities, generation entities, and then distribution entities. PJM has done a couple of things. They have control centers that are kind of at the heart of the electric grid. These centers are responsible for, they use these things to direct the flow of energy. They're critical. So if one of them fails and you only have one, that entire system kind of shuts down. They already have two. They've turned a third into that was formerly for training. They've gotten that up and running, and it's now a third control center. So that allows for greater social distancing, and additional redundancy if one of them is compromised. The staff that run these things are highly specialized. It takes years of training to become a control room operator. So they've shifted staff length from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts to reduce the threat of contagion and handover. They've limited any staff who aren't control room staff from being in the control room. They're going into remote practices. They've revised their response plans. They've started to think through supply chain issues, because the supply chains for these equipment, they're global, and becoming compromised because of coronavirus, because the manufacturing systems are getting a little bit compromised, and staff is harder to come by. So there's a lot going on in that space. Similarly, for wildfires and hurricanes, you have these emergency managers who are figuring out their systems and modifying them, to facilitate kind of a more effective response. So that's the system side, right? That's sort of the official side, and things seem like they're humming. And I mean, I guess we'll see how effective they are come wildfire season, come hurricane season. But my hunch is that these modifications will help a bit, at least. And if they don't, the system engineers will react to that and figure out and modify it until they do. I mean, the human side is totally different, right? It's dependent on a people and a population who may or may not be highly vulnerable, who may or may not have assets and resources, who may or may not be connected with the official response architecture. And figuring out how to, I guess, quote unquote, modify that system and support people, it's a lot harder. So, I mean, FEMA recommends a 72-hour kit for for emergencies, and we're kind of smirking here, and it's shifted to 2 weeks, but there's questions of, okay, if you're broke and you're poor, how do you afford that 72-hour kit? And then you add like the pandemic 72-hour kit, and that's an additional resource. How do you message to people who are hard to reach and hard to message, and maybe rightly distrustful of these official authorities? If you have to evacuate, how do you evacuate people who might be too poor and may not have a vehicle? Usually it's busing, but how do you maintain social distancing when you bus? Shelters. I mean, it's poor and vulnerable that end up staying in these shelters. Usually, if you have money, you can get a hotel room. You can get, if you have social connections, you can stay with your friends and your family. Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of a story of two different systems: the official and then this human one. And I guess my concern is more on the that sort of social and human system.
Would you expect that municipal emergency management offices now, or state offices, are literally coming up with plans, or maybe they've been doing this since March, to deal with low density evacuation shelter and low density cooling center and the many other things that we know are going to come up between June and October around the country? Or they're already maxed, and they're going to have to just respond however they can respond in the moment? I mean, I had Tricia Wachtendorf on, and we talked about improvisation and the many surprises that can come up and the many resiliencies that are not anticipated. But I don't think, particularly in big cities, emergency management offices have the luxury of not planning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's their job to think about the terrible and make it worse and then plan for that. So yeah, I'm sure they are planning, and I'm sure they I mean, I bet many of them already had plans for some of this stuff. Following 9/11, there were these series of sort of health incidents that prompted incident management planning processes to occur. I know, in the utility space, for instance, there were these plans that were developed in response to not a pandemic, but other health outbreaks. But there's a question of whether these plans are, being used, and how useful they are, and whether they're paper plans or actual plans, right? I mean, it's the classic idea of, are these plans reality or are they fantasy documents? The old ones most likely were fantasy documents. These ones that folks are working on, maybe if there's resources there.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're talking to Erin Clark Ginsberg and Miriam Belvidia today about cascading disasters and planning and vulnerable populations. And Miriam, I'd like to turn to you on that. Let's stay with COVID-19 here for a minute. What kind of vulnerabilities are you concerned about? Are you seeing emerging in this moment? How are people reacting creatively? I mean, I think being attentive to that helps us think through some of these even worse scenarios, the ones that Erin is sort of showing us. What's on your mind when you think about COVID-19 and vulnerable populations?
Yeah, well, there's a number of things. So just in response to some of the things that Erin brought up, the importance of redundancy in our socio-technical systems and those social and technical systems is crucial. I think that there's a few examples here in terms of, like in New Orleans, when it comes to our vulnerabilities, and our social vulnerability. So, as we've seen with COVID, the importance of frontline workers, the importance of folks that, before the pandemic may not have been seen as essential, turns out certainly are. And, I think about that sometimes when it comes to also our technical systems, right? So who's maintaining those? For the Sewage and Water Board in New Orleans, you have many folks that are employed locally that we depend on to make sure that our drainage system is operating and that, things are as ready for hurricane season as they can be. We also see things like we have right now sanitation workers in New Orleans that are on strike because they are demanding hazard pay, rightfully so. They are crucial all the time, and in a pandemic, they're faced with even more, potential exposure. So when we think about these sort of things that we take for granted in terms of our, lifelines, our critical services, thinking about who are the people that keep those things going. I think that, COVID-19 has certainly exposed a lot of that and the vulnerability there. The other piece that I want to think about is the importance of trust. So Aaron mentioned, the fact that, when you're trying to get messaging out about whether it's hurricane season or COVID, the importance of that coming from trusted source, and that vulnerable populations, with good reason, may not trust local government officials, state, federal officials. One thing that positive example that I would point to is actually the city of New Orleans just released their sort of, it's the start of hurricane season, time to be prepared video. And they did it really well. This is the first time that I've seen them. They not only had, the mayor and the head of the city council, some of the council representatives in this video, but they also had local celebrities who are trusted voices within communities, right? So they had, Big Frida, who's a very well-known nationally artist and performer. She was in this video. And I think that, it's important that local officials know who the trusted voices are and work with those folks to get what are life-saving messages out there. So another point that sort of was brought up that I think that we need to think about is that, like, as local governments and states are making these moves to address concurrent disasters, is also the loss of revenue. I mean, I know that many cities are facing huge budget shortfalls. In New Orleans, a city that is very much dependent on tourism industry and oil and gas in our state, they're seeing huge budget shortfalls at a time when these government services are especially necessary. So those are just all of the sort of other things to be thinking about when we're considering the impacts of not only COVID-19 but also potential for concurrent disasters. When it comes to vulnerable populations, we are seeing that it's really important when we're thinking about disasters to be intersectional in our approaches, right? So we've done a lot sort of historically to prepare for this. And I think that thinking about sort of who are the folks that are going to be most impacted by a disaster and making sure that you have tailored information, that again, you have trusted folks who can bring that information back to communities. That's really the crucial part in this. One of the examples that I can point to from our resources is that we created a queer and trans guide to hurricane season that we're now in the process of updating for hurricanes plus COVID. And so, the reason that we did that is obviously there's a lot of sort of resources out there that, Aaron mentioned things from FEMA about like the guidance of how much gallon of water to have per person, things like that. But when you think about sort of what are the special needs of different populations, right? Like, so in the queer and trans community, you want to be thinking about like, how are folks going to be treated at shelters? What kind of identification is necessary if that doesn't match their birth name? Are they going to run into issues? Thinking about like what kinds of medications might be necessary. And then also, thinking about the fact that in New Orleans, we have a large transplant community that is not experienced with going through hurricanes, may not have access to transportation, may not have family members that are welcoming if they needed to evacuate someplace. So those are all the sort of key pieces that we're trying to think through. And, you know, when that comes to updating things for hurricane season plus COVID, we're thinking through, you know, what are the pieces that we need to prepare for. So if I have been quarantining, but my usual evacuation spot is with elderly parents, then, you know, is that going to be an issue if I'm going to potentially be exposing them? If we're going to be thinking about our hurricane packing list, you know, making sure obviously that there are masks and sanitizer and things like that included, but just trying to be really mindful of the different scenarios in which we're going to need to, yes, be creative, and then also be providing trusted information to folks that is as useful as possible.
So, Aaron, I want to just to pick up on that. I mean, there's so many important points Miriam was just making. I think about the variability of human experience in disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, and the idea that there's some sort of standard preparation is deeply problematic, and yet so much empathy for what planners try to go through. You know, and there's this conflict there. It's this tension between, are we planning ultimately for the large number of people, or are we really planning? We're sort of letting the large number of people and assuming if they've got resources, they are mostly going to find a way. They're going to rely on the networks that they rely on, and that we really should be doing this emergency planning, this vulnerability planning for those who can't plan. So it's actually planning for a small number. I think about this all the time. I don't know how to resolve that tension. How do you think about that? You know, I mean, you studied emergency management around the world, many different settings. Are these plans for the many, or should they be the plans for the few who need the most?
Yeah.
Solve that for us, Aaron.
Yeah, right. I wish I could just give the easy technocratic answer, but it seems like it's a, you know, it's a political and a social decision.
Sure it is.
One of the it does remind me of, you know, when I worked for Concern Worldwide, and I mean their mission is, I mean it's focused on the poorest of the poor in the most extreme and vulnerable countries. So that type of work. You know, I mean, Concern is committed to it and really trying to interact and engage with these groups and going out of its way to do so. But it's incredibly challenging. And then there's even these debates within the organization of you know, what its scope should be and how it should go about doing this. You know, I mean, for instance, say you're doing an intervention in I don't know, the highlands of Ethiopia in a rural and remote place, you know, and it's 2 days from the capital, and then you have to walk for, you know, 6 hours to get to a village. You know, you could try and target that village, and you know that may be the area with the highest need. Or you know, you could target 10 villages that are still 2 days from the capital, but you know, not a 6-hour walk into the hills. And I mean, there is this question of how you allocate those sorts of limited resources. And you know, I don't really know the answer, but I do think, you know, one of the challenges that organization faced and that a lot of organizations face is that, you know, they aren't graded on whether they're reaching those that have the greatest needs, and they don't get the funding based on that. They get the funding and they're graded based on who they reach and how many people they reach. So it's very easy to you know, get funding and just shovel it out, you know, right across the road, and you won't actually be reaching the population with the biggest need. It's a lot harder to make that argument of, we need an intervention that's twice as much, 3 times as much, because, you know, this group has higher needs and they're harder to get to.
Mm-hmm. So just thinking a bit more about this issue of boundaries that get drawn. I mean, this has been on my mind a lot, and the framing of the concern of hurricane season coming. You know, my thought about that is how arbitrary the temporal lines often are. And Mary, I want to ask you about this because you're in New Orleans. And I've heard people say it doesn't feel like Hurricane Katrina is over yet. And I've been doing research in Port Arthur, Texas, where it's clear that Hurricane Harvey isn't over yet. There's still homes with blue tarps on the roofs. So it isn't, I don't think, that we need to wait and see what happens when we have COVID-19 and the hurricane. We can already see what that looks like because it's ongoing. These are communities that are dealing with COVID-19 and still dealing with hurricanes that have happened. But I guess we don't usually frame it that way. We're always sort of looking for that next disaster that's coming and somehow drawing some limits, distancing ourselves between the old ones. I don't know. There's not a good question in there for you, but maybe just some thinking, some things on my mind about how we maybe arbitrarily decide when a disaster is over and when things have recovered. I mean, how do you approach that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, that is the excellent question. I think that, yes, in emergency management as a discipline, we tend to think of things in sort of phases, right? So you have mitigation, you have preparedness, you have response and recovery, and it's sort of, the cycle, right? Now, I don't think that we're necessarily realistic about the fact that you will have mitigation happening as recovery happens, right? These things overlap and recovery is uneven. It is the folks that are going to be most impacted are going to have a much longer recovery time, and our systems are not designed to help them. There is a lot of talk whenever there is a disaster about sort of making folks whole. But then the reality is that our grants and our systems of getting aid to people are not actually designed to make people whole after a disaster, right? And when you couple that with racism, when you couple that with existing systemic inequities, then you're going to have very uneven recoveries that look very different even within the same city, right? So in New Orleans, right, we are now coming up on 15 years after Katrina, and I live in the lower Ninth Ward, and it looks much different in terms of the recovery here, which has been very patchy, to say the least, compared to, other parts of the city that had more resources before the storm. So I think that just sort of acknowledging in disaster management, we talk a lot about sort of breaking the cycle of, disasters. And that's what a lot of mitigation is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to try to get out of this cycle that we have of, disaster repair, and then another disaster comes and we try to recover from that. Now, I think that as a field, though, unless we are really willing to grapple with these very difficult questions around justice, around equity, that we're not going to actually make much headway when it comes to disaster management. That in order to actually manage disasters, you have to look at what the existing, sort of the pre-existing conditions are within a society. And if you have one in which there's, many disparities, then you're going to have differences in terms of the recovery. And those folks that are most vulnerable are going to be most impacted. And I think that back to this question of sort of do you prepare for the many or the few? I would argue that if you plan for the few, plan for those folks that are most vulnerable, they're also planning for all. If you are creating a world in which the many are also safe, because the world in which those folks are left behind does not create a safer, more just world that I think that ultimately we should be striving for.
That's a really profound statement. Aaron, I'd like to get your reaction to that and just put one additional thing on top of that. Is there a space for emergency managers and disaster planners to be planning with George Floyd's murder in the front of their mind? I mean, is this? I mean, is social injustice, racial injustice? Doesn't that have to be part of the discussion now, or can we continue to make that sort of a separate? That's for somebody else. That's not for Office of Emergency Management. I've given you all of the impossible questions. I'm sorry, but
No, these are good.
this is what we're talking about now. I mean, how can we not have these conversations now?
Yeah, and I mean it's a big fat yes, right? Like you need how can you not have these conversations, and how can you not plan and mitigate, respond, recover, whatever by in a way that separates one social injustice from another social injustice that in reality they're all fairly linked. I mean, I think so some of these ideas you can there is decent literature and research out there that could be kind of drawn to help conceptualize some of this stuff. So I'm thinking specifically about the idea of allostatic load, and allostatic load. I mean, it's a term that's been around, a concept that's been around for a while in the health field, but it's.
I had to look it up.
Yeah,
you mentioned it to me, and for people listening, don't feel bad. Allostatic, ALLOSTATIC, allostatic load.
And I
keep going. It's a great concept, and one that I think people should be aware of if they're not.
Yeah, and I was doing a project on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and that's when I came across it. But it gets at a lot of this. It helps you understand, I think, some of the systemic issues and how a disaster never really ends, and how it intertwines with all of these other processes. So allostatic load, it basically refers to the price that the body pays for conditions of stress, for being under stress for a repeated period of time. So it's think of it kind of as the straw that broke the camel's back, right? You may be exposed to a certain trauma, violence. There is some emerging work that's talking about natural hazards. And that'll result in things like, mental health challenges, depression, but also physical health. So high blood pressure. There have been studies that have linked the experience of earthquakes to heart attacks far down the line. And I mean, it's also an idea that's kind of expanding to the community sphere. So thinking about how trauma can be passed down within communities over the course of generations. So something like Katrina, that could contribute to a community's allostatic load. But something like slavery could also definitely contribute to a community's allostatic load. And I mean, I think that sort of concept and that idea, I mean, it builds on a lot of stuff on kind of like poverty traps, right? That we know, where a hazard interacts with somebody who's vulnerable, and they get left way worse than they were before, and they fall into this downward cycle of poverty. This is the sort of physical manifestation of that, and I mean these hazards, be they natural or be they acts of violence and racism, they take a toll. They take a toll on the economy of people, society of people, and people's physical and mental well-being. So yeah, I mean, when does a disaster end? I don't really know. When you have concepts like this that kind of draw it out and extend it.
Well, you mentioned even going back to slavery, and in fall of last year, I had the opportunity for the first time to go to Whitney Plantation. Miriam, you may know this, and a shout out to my friend Ashley Rogers and all the people that have been working there. And so this is a plantation, those of you who are familiar with it, this is not a plantation in Louisiana where they do weddings. This is a plantation where you get the story of what it was like to be an enslaved person there. And it cuts against the grain of most of what is sort of plantation tourism in Louisiana. And when you visit there, at least my sense of it was, you're right next door to places like Reserve, Louisiana. You're in the middle of Cancer Alley. How can you possibly pull apart those things, that flow of historical time? But I mean, again, Miriam, to you is, thinking about how you actually turn that knowledge into more justice when it comes to the really hard work of planning and planning for events that are going to happen. How do we manage those different timescales? How do you approach them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've asked some weighty questions, but the good news is that it is possible to do this. Like, we are doing it.
We got 57 minutes into the conversation before anybody said there was good news. I got to do better about that. I'm so sorry.
No. I mean, I don't want to make light of the challenge, right? But what I would say is that, with Imagine Waterworks, like, we are addressing these very issues. And I think that there's a few sort of key points, right? One is the importance of organizing direct aid. So part of what Imagine Waterworks has been doing in terms of our COVID response is that we started a mutual aid response network that is about 2,400 people. It operates on Facebook. That's actually how Aaron and I connected in the first place. And we are seeing, as we've seen in disasters, going back for many years, the importance of neighbors helping neighbors and the importance of direct aid. So I would highlight that as one of the keys to addressing any kinds of concurrent disasters, is that we need to be thinking about this in terms of mutual aid, right? It's not necessarily focusing on government response, while that is important. It is thinking about how neighbors are going to help neighbors, because those will be the first responders in a disaster. And thinking about how we can do that in a way that is anti-racist, that is focused on those folks that are going to be most impacted. Thinking about, we are now transitioning our COVID mutual aid group, which has been providing things like housing, food, shelter. We are transitioning that now to also be dealing with hurricane season, and that's going to require some modifications and thinking through it. But the good news is that we can, and I would just offer that, these are big challenges, but these are challenges that especially Black and Indigenous folks have been grappling with and have been responding to and managing for generations. And so there is a lot of wisdom there within communities of color, within like the folks that are most impacted. And so letting people lead who have that experience is going to get us different results. We can't keep sort of having the same approaches and then expecting things to shift. We really, I think, need to prioritize the folks that are most impacted and allow them to be taking the lead. And it is very possible to do that. And I will say it's possible to do that with almost no resources. Like, we are seeing, the ability to mobilize large groups of people using things like Facebook, using online organizing strategies, and I think that in addition to the importance of centering and elevating, Black and Indigenous folks doing this work, it's also really important to see that we need to have many different perspectives and expertise in the room. So, I come from a more traditional emergency management, hazard mitigation background, but our work would not be successful if it wasn't for the other folks on our team who include, healers and include digital strategists, and include folks that have communications backgrounds. We need all of this kind of knowledge. And crucially, it includes, 2 Native New Orleanians who have been through disasters personally. So me as a transplant, I've learned an immense amount. I've learned more, I will say, about disaster management from folks that have gone through it than I ever learned in school. And I had a very good education in the subject. So that would just be sort of my my plug for the importance of local leadership, of community wisdom when we're trying to deal with these questions that do seem sort of overwhelming at times.
And would you describe that work as, Miriam, as activism? I mean, do you see that as, because that's a word that sometimes I think in emergency management, more generally in professional cultures, frankly, and I speak for the academy generally, that, well, we don't, we might do everything you just said, but we don't want to call it activism. We want to step back from that line a little bit. And maybe you haven't used the phrase either, but I mean, is it one that you embrace? Is that kind of planning activist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, I don't sort of see any negative side to activism. I think, the term that I think we use more readily is sort of organizing, right? Like there is a lot of organizing culture that infuses our work. I mean, also sort of principles from social work, like there's many different kinds of knowledge, but I think that like community organizing is a crucial part of emergency management. And I think that, if we're doing our job right, like if activism means challenging the status quo and pushing for more equitable like outcomes in disasters, then like absolutely, I think that is very much needed.
Erin, just to bring that over to some of the more professional cultures that you've studied, thinking about what happens in a municipal, state, or even in FEMA emergency management, HQ. We bring those kind of ideas inside there. What kind of reaction do you get?
Yeah, I mean, it's varied, right? When you think about FEMA HQ or these different municipalities, I mean, some of them are really trying and thinking in this sort of way, thinking about the social construction of risk, and trying to make that part of their practice. Others are not. I mean, I think when you look at it from, you move it from individual to organizational, there are maybe some sort of trends. And I think I've thought about this, kind of comparing my knowledge of the U.S. system with how things work in other countries, and some of the developing countries that I've been to, and I mean within these very kind of generalizations of the U.S. approach compared to the developing country approach, I do feel like there is in some ways some lip service paid to a lot of this stuff, right? Like, so FEMA, purports to take this whole community approach, and there's folks whose job it is to try and engage with the community, and same with that municipal level, and but if you look at the structures that are there, and if you look at kind of the backgrounds of a lot of these staff, and how projects are developed, there's a lot that can kind of be desired, I guess. So, in a lot of developing country contexts, you'll have something like, a community committee that is responsible for disaster risk reduction and risk management. That's comprised of leaders of that community, and I'm using community in kind of the broad word, and it's very diverse, right? So there'll be leaders, there may be representatives of different groups, sometimes marginalized and vulnerable groups, and they'll come up with with ideas, and come up with these general disaster risk reduction and risk management plans, and then work with the governmental authorities to try and turn them into something actionable, and something that can be funded either by the government, or by the cacophony of international NGOs that are kind of wandering around and subsuming a lot of government responsibilities. I mean, that model has a ton of faults, right? It places an incredible load on local communities. It can, and there's no sort of governmental ownership over a lot of this stuff. It's abandonment more than it's solidarity. But it also, in some ways offers a model where, you can see through these, I think kind of what Miriam's talking about, these broader, almost community development type initiatives. You can get representation, and you can get, projects that reflect community values and attempt to kind of challenge the status quo. I think it's totally difficult with the professional cultures of emergency management and, backgrounds in rapid response, often fire and police, rather than this community development, weird mitigation stuff that's needed. That's this, that's a completely different sort of beast and approach. So things need to change, but I agree that there's models out there that could potentially help facilitate some of that change and be useful.
Well, we're almost up on time. I just want to thank both of our guests, and just to give you one sort of, if you have a final word or something that's your sort of forefront of your mind as we go into hurricane season, a trick of the trade or another group we should be watching, or somebody you want to amplify. Miriam, can I start with you?
Sure. I think that, to sort of circle back to where our conversation started, emergency management as a field, I'll use the example. When I started working for the city of New Orleans, I was in the mitigation division of Homeland Security for the city. And we were sort of quite literally, we were a 3-person office that was quite literally like tucked back in like another part of the building, separated from the rest of the local emergency managers in Homeland Security. And we brought sort of a different approach to the work, but the culture within emergency management, at least at the local level at that point in time, was very heavily influenced by the military, right? There were a lot of folks that were coming out of the military background, but then go into emergency management. And that, I think, is changing somewhat. But I recall I went on sort of a ride along with some of these emergency managers that were tasked with doing outreach at the beginning of hurricane season. This was back in 2008. And they were going to essentially warn folks in a local nursing home that was overwhelmingly Black. And these were white emergency managers going in and essentially yelling at the residents in this senior sort of assisted living facility about the need to be ready for hurricane season, and being incredibly, disrespectful, not thinking about the trauma that these people had endured just 3 years previously with Katrina. It was a completely, inappropriate, ineffectual way to do preparedness, to engage with residents. And this kind of command and control approach, which we're also obviously seeing in police reactions to the protests, is, I think, part of the issue when we think about sort of the culture of emergency management. And if we are going to change, again, the outcomes, that is very possible. It just means also changing the culture. And, I think that what we have seen with Imagine Waterworks is that it is very possible, with the right facilitation, with the right leadership, to set expectations for, being anti-racist, for considering equity, considering those folks who are most impacted in any kind of disaster management. It's not rocket science. It just takes intention and leadership. And I think that is what I hope for going forward, is that, whether it is in response to the protests and the uprising that we're seeing currently, or whether it's in response to COVID or hurricanes, that really centering the folks that are most impacted and listening will get us much further than we've gotten in the past.
I have to say, as a historian, I tend to focus more on continuity than change, and I often reject the idea that disasters order some sort of unexpected new world. And yet, we are seeing combinations of things right now that we haven't certainly seen in my lifetime. And it may open the way for these kind of culture shifts that you're talking about, Miriam, because certainly what we're seeing right now hasn't worked in these last 3 months. Aaron, I wanted to come to you for the last word. Anything we missed or anything you want to highlight here as we close out the discussion today?
No, I think we covered everything. This was great. I came in feeling depressed, and I still feel a bit depressed, but it's cathartic to sort of talk through some of these issues. And Miriam, I think listening to you kind of outlining some of the solutions here makes me feel a little bit more hopeful. I tend to maybe think a lot about the negatives and the problems, and I'd love to see more and think more about, we have these things that can work. How do we get them to work everywhere, and how do we turn that into something that can not just be picked up by FEMA and used as another tool, but can actually lead to some sort of real change. I think we have kind of a ton of work ahead of us, but there is that sort of glimmer of hope there that these sorts of changes are possible.
I'd like to remind everyone that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and tomorrow we have the first of a month of discussions. This will happen once a week with scientists from the Academy of Natural Sciences. Tomorrow we're going to talk about biodiversity and COVID-19. It's been a really fascinating conversation. Please join me tomorrow and every weekday at 5 p.m. for COVID Calls. And I want to thank my guests today, Miriam Belglidia and Aaron Clark Ginsberg, getting us moving into hurricane season, thinking about all of the bad things that can happen, but also I think finding some hope and creativity and solidarity in there as well. Thank you both so much for this conversation today.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Really
Stay healthy,
it.
everyone. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Take care.